Welcome back, everybody. Sharon Toerek here, the Innovative Agency, and taking the opportunity today to get a little bit meta in our conversation with our guest. We are going to, on my podcast, talk about long form content and particularly podcasting and where we are with it and why it matters and why it's such a medium. That is well adapted to the way you need to be thinking about your content strategy now, um, in the point of view of our guest, whom I happen to agree with. But speaking of, Roger Nairn, welcome to the show. Thank you so much
Thanks.
for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Sharon.
So you co-founded JAR Podcast Solutions, with your partner. How long have you guys been at it now?
Yeah, we're almost coming up to 10 years. And at the time, there was very few in the podcast space that were working with brands like we do. And yeah, it's a different world now.
It is a different world, but I have to say that lately I've started to feel like um, we're back to the future a little bit in terms of findability, discoverability of our businesses and our clients' businesses. And I wanted to get your perspective on that because I told you before we started recording, in our brief conversation that was something you had published at the beginning of this year really resonated with me, and that was the rediscovery of our affection for the long form content.
Hmm.
And your point of view was about and around its importance right now, which kind of feels contra if if you think about it quickly, because our attention spans are shorter than ever.
Yep.
However, so is trust. Trust is shorter and lower than ever. And so let's start there a little bit. You
Sure.
cited the Edelman Trust Barometer, which had just been published recently as we're recording this, and wove that into sort of your perspective. And let's talk about long form content and why you feel it's so important right now, first of all, for the
Yeah.
agency owners listening.
Yeah, you talked about the Edelman Trust Barometer. I follow it every year, and this year was really interesting because I think for the first time in a very long time, most of the institutions are dropping in trust, whether it's government, whether it's journalism, but businesses are actually maintaining trust, and in a lot of ways, in some cases, they're being seen more favorably and trusted. But trust as a whole is fragile. Institutions wobble, expertise matters, and transparency matters more than ever. And to your point, the world is definitely in love with its short form right now. However, if you do really care about trust as an organization, you should be investing in long form because of just the nature of long form. It does increase trust in your company or your agency or your clients, or your clients' brands, mostly because audiences want expertise, transparency, and proof. Long form is one of the few formats where a brand can actually demonstrate those things instead of just claiming them.
Mhm.
So that's to me the move that we all need to consider in 2026. And it's not to say that you need to ignore short form, but there is very much still a world where long form plays a huge role.
So when your agency happens to work for mid-market and enterprise size clients, right?
Yep.
When you are talking to your marketing counterparts at these client companies, at the brands, and their reaction to that is, what is this going to mean for our business results? And
Yeah.
how are we going to know how it's affecting our business results and what are reasonable expectations? Because I'm guessing that most agency owners listening to this get similar questions from,
Hmm.
sometimes it's the what's my ROI going to be question, sometimes it's a how long is it going to take for us to see results question. But what do you tell your brand counterparts about how to measure the effectiveness of long form content versus some of the other tactics they might employ?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for us, it's all about engagement. It's all about that consumption rate. So if we're talking about a podcast and considering, and keep in mind, a podcast can be audio or video. So we could be measuring our shows through Apple or Spotify or on YouTube. But either way, we take the consumption number as the prime metric to be following, because if we can get an audience member to listen or consume the show for as long as possible. And I'll give you a perfect example. We just recently reported to our client at Amazon that each individual audience member is spending over 2.5 hours listening to their podcast every month.
Hmm.
So to be able to come back to them and say that's 2.5 hours being spent with your brand that they're opting into,
Mhm.
that's pretty remarkable and something that you can't get from very many other mediums. Maybe you can lock them in a conference room for for half a
Right.
day, but but uh, but for the most part, podcasts have that ability to capture your attention and then keep it for a very, very long time. So to us, obviously, the longer you're listening or watching, the more of affinity you're going to have for that brand because it's the one delivering that content to you. And there's lots of different structural things that need to happen in order for that to be successful. But there is, and as long as you're being authentic and delivering material in a way that is connecting with that audience, you're going to see an increase in trust. And we measure that through brand lift studies and a number of different ways.
Mhm. Do you have a perspective on whether the medium of audio broadcasting versus video broadcasting is more effective? I mean, I know the belt and suspender is to do both, but
Yep.
if you're if either you have a reluctant host or for whatever reason one format might be preferable to another, what are some of the consideration points that brands should consider and agencies should be thinking about when if they need to choose one over the other? Which are more effective for which kind of use cases, I guess is what I'm asking.
hmm Yeah. So the first question we'll always ask is about their audience. Like, do you have any data that shows where are they consuming podcasts? And I'll give you a perfect example. Some research came out from Signal Hill Insights, which specializes in podcast measurements and consumption information. They came out with a report that said that business executives tend to skew towards consuming podcasts on audio.
Hmm.
And I think that makes a ton of sense. I mean, they're more mobile, they're running through airports, they're heading to different meetings, they have long commutes. They tend to listen through audio because it's just so much more convenient than watching video. Maybe they're on their treadmill as well, walking their dog. But also they like to go in depth on certain topics and level up their career or their company or whoever it is that they're working on. So we always start with who the audience is, and obviously the audience is going to be different no matter which client you're speaking to. Those that have a bit more of a younger audience tend to skew video, but even with video these days, there's not a ton of examples where having the podcast living on YouTube is the prime reason why people are consuming that podcast. Now they are discovering it through YouTube because of the
Okay.
algorithm. YouTube is the number one source of discoverability for podcasts, but oftentimes they're discovering it, but then jumping into an audio platform, or they're sometimes switching between the two.
Interesting.
So it kind of again, it really depends on the audience and where they live. And sure, you're going to have some podcasts that are a little bit more maybe celebrity based that have that visual aspect to it that
Mhm.
people want to see their celebrities. Some shows obviously have a little bit of a sort of visual nature to them that something needs to be described and displayed. There are obvious use cases, but it's definitely not a one size fits all.
Got it. Are there any, I mean, when an agency's being asked to advise on a whole potential array of options, right, for their client, how do you know what's the right goal matching between the client's aspirations and the business results that a marketing tactic might be able to help them achieve? How do you know when podcasting needs to be in the top of your recommendation set?
Yeah.
I'm obviously a believer, but not every brand that an agency talks to is convincible. So
Mhm.
what do you need to know, and what needs to factor into your decision making to recommend?
So the number one question I encourage agencies to ask their client is what is the job that this podcast needs to do? Do we need to be increasing thought leadership? Do we need to be engaging with a certain audience and deepening our relationship with them? Or do we need to be perhaps changing minds and maybe educating the audience on a certain misconception or a certain topic.
Hmm.
Based on that, there are certain roles that your podcast can play within the funnel, and typically they're going to be in the top of funnel, mid funnel space. Building brand awareness, engagement, but then education and helping with that consideration side of it. Now, keeping in mind that this is branded entertainment, so you can't, part of my language, but barf out a bunch of brand into the show. It needs to very much be about delivering value to your audience.
Hmm.
We treat our podcasts like a gift that you're giving that audience. This is classic content marketing, but you're giving that gift to the audience, and they just happen to know that it's coming from XYZ brand.
Hmm.
Now, that's where it gets a bit challenging lower down in the funnel, because if you start to use it as a lead generator or as a sort of a sales tactic, you're inevitably going to have to insert more of the brand into the show. And so the more you add in, the dicier it's going to be, because why would I want to invest, 30, 45 minutes of my time listening to essentially an advertisement? I still need
Hmm.
that brand delivery. So we actually, this is selling ourselves actually, but we actually have an ad product now where we can essentially strip out all the brand mention from the episode and instead retarget the listeners of your podcast with advertising that essentially is targeted to the podcast listeners. So you can kind of keep the advertising side of it church and state, keep it off,
That's
keep it off
creative.
show. Yeah. I mean, we understand that at the end of the day, these shows need to work from a business perspective, and they need to meet the objectives of whatever it is, what the job is of the podcast. But as anybody knows, the more you inject sort of selly language and stuff about the brand into anything, it's just going to be less worthy of someone's time.
Right. Well, and it also, it seems to me, it gives you another bite of the apple, right? If you're stripping the brand mentions and creating real estate to perhaps feature other opportunities, then you've gotten more leverage out of your content,
Hmm.
conceivably, right?
Yeah, and that's the other bit is no matter what the objectives are of the podcast, I would say that any agency who has a client that requires a large breadth of content, start with a podcast, because the podcast can act like the spine of your content marketing program. Every episode is going to shed a transcript, which you can then turn around into a blog post or a white paper or material for a newsletter. Every podcast is going to, be able to be clippable into, audiograms or little, video clips. Every episode can be used in, materials for live events. Some of our clients do. There's really no rules. So I always talk to agencies and say that a podcast is a great revenue generator for the agency itself, because it opens up the opportunity to do so much more with your client.
Let's talk a little bit about what I generally like to refer to as findability, because the terminology is changing so quickly from, I mean, SEO is dead. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Now it's AEO. Now it's GEO. I'm just going to say the ability for someone or some company or something to be found digitally or online.
Mhm.
Talk about the where podcasting and long form content fit into findability as that landscape is evolving, with all the AI platforms that are, punching each other out of the way to bring people to your doors for whatever it is that you happen to sell or your client happens to sell.
Totally. So we do leverage the metadata from each episode so that it is findable in, all the different AEO ways these days. But also, a podcast is still very much a shareable medium. So we do have different methods that we, add to it to make the show discoverable within your communities and your friends. But then one of the biggest pieces, and this just takes old-fashioned legwork, is we deploy a cross-promotion strategy where we're doing, first of all, we do the research to understand, and there's some technology we use where we discover what we would call podcast neighborhoods
Mhm.
attached to your podcast. In other words, what are the other podcasts that your audience is also listening to? And are we starting to notice little trends and pockets, what we would call neighborhoods?
Mhm.
Based on that, we'll craft different pitches based on those neighborhoods and start to pitch those shows on why our host should be a guest on your show in exchange for them coming on our show maybe, or in exchange for us, sharing their show through our social channels. There,
Mhm.
again, really no rules, and that way we can essentially share audiences and increase the discoverability of the show that way. But then also there's so much within these large organizations that they just don't leverage that is owned by them. I mean, think about your blog, think about your newsletter, think about your employees. Like your employees are going to be some of the biggest fans of your show, and they're going to want to disseminate it amongst their communities. So it's really kind of taking stock of what's available from a own perspective, and taking and leveraging that, packaging things up so that they're right for those channels, whether it's TikTok or whether it's LinkedIn or a newsletter. And then there's also things like the industry type channels that you want to leverage, create relationships with. And then there's the owned side of it, which I know is not discoverable, but there is still a huge opportunity to treat podcast advertising like, or to use the sort of programmatic side of podcast advertising so that you're hitting a specific audience or hitting listeners of certain shows or hitting specific demographics to increase audience.
It seems like it's kind of a spider's web, findability is, and
Yeah, it is.
like the podcast is maybe, in the center of it, but it's how you leverage it or pieces of it. And the more of that you do, it sounds like what you're saying, the more likely it is to create a return for the brand, right?
Yeah, it takes work. I mean, you have to think of it like your entertainment executive working for Paramount, and you're releasing, the next Incredible Hulk film. Now
Right.
you're not just going to show previews in theaters. You're also going to, be in this channel and this channel and this channel and this channel, and you're going to test and learn and figure out what works. So it used to be that podcasts were added into sort of campaigns, and now agencies are able to treat the podcast as its own campaign and craft and strategize a lot of other materials around it.
We are all media companies, are we not?
Yeah,
Even a law firm is a media company, an agency
100%.
is its own media company. I mean, I feel like everything you're describing just reminds me that every business needs to think of themselves that way, um, in order to stay relevant and top of mind, with any buyer, right? Whether you're B2B or
Absolutely.
B2C, it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, expertise still matters, and long form is, in my opinion, the best way to deliver expertise. It's where expertise gets a chance to breathe and have nuanced conversations and maybe be a little bit edgy and have some diverse opinions and
Mhm.
it's those sorts of conversations that increase trust. Going back to the beginning of the conversation, that transparency, we have we have the ability to spread transparency at scale when, if you set up the right show.
Right, right. So let's say you drink the Kool-Aid for those of you listening who are maybe a little bit older, like yours truly here, and you know what Kool-Aid is, and you've been
I know what
podcasting.
it is.
Well, I hope we're around the same age, so but thank you for the love. I appreciate it. So let's say you were maybe an early adopter or you've been in the podcast game for a while and it's feeling a little um less than effective. It's not hitting on all the cylinders that it did when it was maybe fresher, or it's not resonating the way that you need for it to in order to justify the investment of time or money or whatever. You put out some really, really interesting prescriptive ideas around how to think about freshening it and making more relevant. So talk about that for those of us who've been in the game for a while, or for agencies whose clients come to them and say, "Yeah, we've been doing a podcast, but it's not doing anything for us," or "It used to be great, but now it's just getting lost in the noise." So how do we need to be thinking about that? And how do
Yeah.
we need to be adjusting and tweaking it for relevance in 2026 and beyond to meet its goals?
Well, I think, first of all, there's never been more great examples of awesome storytelling in podcast form than there are today. So, first of all, copy some of those, steal some of those ideas at least.
Mhm.
But also, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of agencies and brands out there that are experts in short form storytelling. Let's say it's TikTok, for example, that needs a strong hook and really quick snackable points and a point of view and perspective and synthesizing your ideas. There's really no difference between that and just spreading that out into a long form format with a podcast. So using some of those skills that you already have and changing up the format so that it's a little bit more so that it's more engaging. I mean, I think so many companies are addicted to the sort of talking head. And this is nothing against you, Sharon, but this sort of style of talking head kind of
Yeah,
interview style because it is the easiest of all the different formats. But breaking out of that into something that's a little bit more narrative, that tells a little bit more of a story, not only is that a more kind of fun way to listen to audio, but science wise, there's actually some techniques that are being deployed there because as the story's being told, or maybe as multiple voices are being added into this sort of interview style, what you're doing is you're actually freshening, or you're keeping the brain, fresh and connected to whatever it is that's being said. Whereas if you just have sort of a 30-minute conversation and maybe there's just not a lot of change in voice and there's not a lot of change in tone, the
right.
listener's brain, whether they know it or not, kind of switches off a little bit. And so I think, in 2026, try different formats that feel a little bit more fun and engaging and something that you would want to listen to.
Mhm.
Plus, I think the biggest mistake that a lot of brands make when it comes to their existing shows and sort of hitting that plateau is that they forget that audience out there that's listening wants to be a part of the production. They want to give you feedback. They want to help with topic ideas and they want to provide you with some fresh thinking on maybe it's a case study they want you to talk about, or maybe it's a certain guest they want to hear from. So don't be afraid to reach out to those people in your audience, whether it's through your social channels or maybe you've got a great newsletter list, and ask them for some ideas, and then deploy them and mention, hey, we got this great idea for an
Mhm.
episode or maybe this little mini series that we're going to do. We heard from the audience. We're going to give it a shot. We'd love to hear what you think.
I love that idea. I love the idea of co-creation, at least in the concepting of it. And this all kind of falls within the change the container point of view that you expressed. in one of your blog posts, which I would highly recommend everybody goes to JARS. If you're interested in podcasting, great thought leadership there on the blog there, at JAR Podcast Solutions website. But you talk about change the container, and you've just given us a couple ideas, but what are some other ways to think about changing the container, if you will? First of all, what do you mean by change the container? Are you referring to the structure of the show? Or?
Referring to the structure of the show. I
Okay.
mean, uh, uh, so operationally, when you're producing a podcast, it is generally recommended that you keep the format of the show the same so that you're not running from episode to episode and just like trying completely different things and just
Yeah,
sort of, burning
like a
yourself
variety
out.
show.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. However, but also from a listening perspective or watching perspective, the audience comes to expect a certain format and a certain sort of pace and flow of an episode. Oh, this is the part of the episode where they do this, or this is the part of the episode where they do that. And so you want to kind of keep that there, unless you're trying something different and you want their feedback. So when
Hmm.
we say change the container, it's very much change the format. Maybe you're going to try something that's more of like a panel discussion. Maybe you're going to do something a bit more documentary based and you're on the street and you're sort of going through the alleyway and you're telling the story about the history of such and such, and then discussing it in depth more on the show.
Hmm.
Giving the episode a little bit more what I would call texture. We all have really great recorders these days, and they happen to be on our phones.
Right.
You can get great audio from an iPhone. So bring it with you and start recording some ambient sound. Just sort of change the container so that the show lives in something a little bit fresher.
Do you have any suggestions about which types of formats work more effectively in which types of industries, for
Yeah.
example? Yeah,
So
I'd love to hear that.
if you're working for a client in an industry that I would say is more kind of science based or a little bit more sort of tech focused, something that has a lot more storytelling included in it makes quite challenging topics a lot more easier to understand and digest.
Hmm.
So I'll give you a perfect example. We work with an organization called Genome BC for their podcast, Nice Genes. And the podcast is about genomics. It's a very, very complex topic. However, we strip down all that complexity into storytelling, fun, relatable stories that are very human centered and of course happen to be related to genomics. And the host does a great job of kind of reconnecting what we're talking about to genomics. I'll give you another example. We did some work with the Port of Vancouver called Breaking Bottlenecks. Now in the logistics world, which is a very dry topic,
Yeah.
the idea of a bottleneck is that if there's a train derailment in, Omaha, Nebraska, it's going to completely disrupt the entire network of logistics all the way down to the southern tip of Florida, and
Mhm.
therefore, the toys are not going to get on the shelves in time in southern Florida. Well, we tell the story of exactly what are some of these scenarios and how do they happen. And of course, the takeaway is this idea of an interconnected system and logistics, and but there can just be a lot more fun had in that storytelling, but also it is a more effective way of storytelling.
Right.
If you're doing something a little bit more kind of small business focused, small business leadership focused, business owners, us being them ourselves, love hearing the sort of war stories of what's going right, but most importantly, what's going wrong in different businesses. I think podcasting has a bit of an addiction with like telling the perfect story about it's usually a bro,
Yeah.
kind of, dominating their industry and their business. But
Yeah.
what about the failures? Like, what about the challenges? Like, tell us about the time that you and your partner split up because you just had opposing views and you were never going to figure it out. Like, those
Mhm.
are the real things. So we do a show with Amazon called "This Is Small Business," and it's literally that. It's very in-depth conversations with business owners about their business. And the takeaway is always that these people get me. Like these people are my people.
Right.
And we get really long engagement rates, and we've had millions of listens, and it's been a big success. I think we're on season 7 now.
Wow.
Yeah,
Well, it's always, I mean, it's great to either hear a light at the end of the tunnel story, or if that's not the ending that occurred, it's always lovely to get a learning from somebody else's, adversity and experience.
totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What do you feel like the industry, the podcasting industry, and folks who choose to use podcasts as part of their marketing stack, if you will, what are some of the biggest changes we're all going to be seeing over the next year to year and a half? What do we need to be thinking about and preparing for?
So obviously AI is the topic that I'm you probably all have on your minds now.
Yeah.
AI is making scalability of podcasts easier, and we definitely use AI in our business, whether it's research or bouncing some concept ideas off and kind of analyzing different things. We've also looked into some synthetic research, things like that, but at the end of the day, when it comes to great storytelling, now, are you going to want to hear a story about a guy who climbed Mount Everest with no legs? Or do you want to hear from the guy himself who climbed Mount Everest with no legs? Now, I would argue that the second one is probably going to be a better story and is going to have more of an emotional connection. So I think podcasts are one of those um, channels that yes, you're gonna, keep moving forward in the production side of it and making the actual accessibility and production easier, but there will be this sort of side of the business that won't move at the speed of light with AI and instead will stay grounded in true, authentic stories and will be really focused on hearing from real people and we hear all these trends of like people moving away from digital and back to analog and things like that. I think one of the places that they'll find refuge in from a entertainment and consumption standpoint is podcasts for that reason.
Well, I mean, despite the cost of production, which are, as you pointed out, going to reduce if people use these new tools, the cost of access to podcast content is almost nothing. And so, in terms of a barrier between a brand and the end client, right, the end consumer or buyer, um, there really isn't any. It's just a matter of them finding you, right? And from
Yeah, and
what
I
I'm
know
hearing,
that I know that like one of the things that you talk a lot about is agencies owning their own IP, and I think that as a if there is any other podcast agencies out there, and I think this is applicable to any creative agency these days, is that as the production becomes more accessible and less expensive and easier to operate because of AI, it's the IP that's created within these agencies, and it's something that we're really big on and focus on these days that can't necessarily be replicated by AI because it's the IP is based around our taste and our individual expertise and what we're able to bring to our client relationships.
I would just like to say that I did not pay Roger to say that or
I'm a
in any
big
way
fan of the show,
incentivize him.
Sharon.
I appreciate that, and that is a soapbox issue for me. And I wasn't expecting it to come up in a conversation about long form content and podcasting, but yes, yes, 100% yes to everything you just said. This is another area where agencies can harness their unique methodologies, their unique secret sauces of doing things, and turn them into ownable, marketable, monetizable IP. So enough
Mhm.
said there. Thank you for the tee up. I was not expecting this soapbox today,
And
but
just
I
as a
love it.
side note, if there's any readers out there, there's a great book that, as I'm saying this, is now escaping me. I want to say it's Monsters of Madison Avenue. Oh goodness. It is about the agency Huge and how they went through a complete change and into a more product-based model, and it's exactly what we're talking about. We can splice in my answer later, but
Yeah, we'll drop the title in the
I
show
can't
notes.
believe
We'll
I'm
definitely
forgetting
do that.
this.
Yeah, no, that's a
But
great idea.
it's based off of the book Mad Men of Madison Avenue,
Yeah.
and it is awesome. It completely, aside from your show, it is one of the things that completely got us to rethink the way we operate and the way we sell and the way we put ourselves out in the world.
I appreciate that. And I love a good agency IP story. So I don't know that book, but I'm going to find that book and we'll drop the title in the show notes for anybody else who's
can't
interested.
can't believe I forgot.
That's okay.
I've been focusing on client podcasts all day. I've got podcasts on the brain and not books.
I hear you. I hear you. We all need a variety of information inputs, right? And sometimes it
Totally.
gets scrambled in our head. This has
Yeah.
been an amazing walk through something that obviously it's important to me personally because of my interest in the medium, but I think to every agency owner who's trying to figure out, first of all, where podcasts might fit into a recommendation strategy for their client brands, also needs to be something they think about in terms of their own business building, um, because we all know that business development gets more challenging all the time for agencies. And so anything you can do to have a leg up, and certainly your unique expertise, your network, every agency to some degree or another has these things, and a podcast might just be the perfect way to pull them all together to create real estate there that's going to pay dividends for your business one way or another.
And I'll mention that if there are agencies out there that, just don't know how to talk to a client about a podcast or perhaps is interested in, adding that to their sort of list of services, we love to white label, but also I'm an ex-agency guy myself. I was with DDB and Cassette for 22 plus years. I love dealing with agency folk. So
Mhm.
if you ever want to reach out and just blue sky some stuff with us, we have always loved those sorts of early conversations and are more than happy to support you.
Awesome. That's amazing. Where are the best places for folks to find you, Roger?
Yeah, check out jarpodcast.com. I'm also on LinkedIn and love to connect with people there. So reach out to me and say hi.
Awesome. This has been a fabulous conversation. I've learned a lot. I hope everybody else listening has as well. So, Roger, thank you so much for joining me today on Innovative Agency. And thanks to the rest of you for joining us and continuing to join us. We are going on almost episode 350 soon. It's hard to believe that we've been doing it as long as we have, and that the medium is still going strong according to everything that we've talked about today. So we will see you the next time around. And until then, everyone, we stay well. Take care. Bye.